I'm going to steer you through an afternoon of more focused sessions. And I think as was described by Mike earlier on, we're starting at 30,000 feet and we're drilling down into some specifics, which I think is always a good way to format these things. Our first speaker is technology permitting, beaming in from Boulder, Colorado. And he's Paul Batchelder, who's the Chief Clinical Officer for Element Boulder, which I understand is a recent joiner to the group and was formerly part of Clinimark. Paul and myself share a bit of a past because I see he's worked a lot with Amida and Datex, Amida and GE Healthcare. And my roots are in that. In fact, I've sat in the office in Amida's office in Boulder, Colorado, looking at the Rocky Mountains, a fabulous spot. He's currently designated US ASTM technical expert to the International Standards Organization on pulse oximetry, and has an informal liaison with the FDA and the ISO blood pressure standards committee. So you can gather, I think a lot of this is going to be focusing on pulse oximetry and experiences in that rapidly developing field. It's been around a long time, but it's still developing. So I'm hoping I can hand over to Paul at this stage. Can I?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes, Paul.
Hey, well, thanks for that introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. Here in Colorado, it's the top of the morning, so I'm just preparing to head off to the laboratories after our talk today. We are a physiology laboratory that specializes...
Sorry, Paul.
Yes?
You might have to share your screen, I think, otherwise we won't see your slides.
Oh, I thought you guys were going.
Terrific, done. We can see them now. That's great. Thanks.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think someone there is going to be advancing my slides. So that's the second slide. That's good. We're a physiology laboratory specializing in accuracy testing of physiological monitors. We test the accuracy of these monitors, such as blood pressure, pulse oximeters, respiratory rate, exhaled carbon dioxide, ECG, multi-parameter monitors, wearables, tablets, and so forth. After testing, the data is then submitted to the FDA, notified bodies, and other regulatory agencies around the globe. The FDA then determines the suitability for use in hospitals. Now, Element conducts all sorts of testing for medical devices, emissions, leakage, and so forth. But today we'll focus on the clinical human side of device testing. Now, issues in human testing is what we're going to talk about. And today our agenda will start with examples using pulse oximetry and blood pressure to emphasize the points. Now, we'll be talking about standards, requirements, and guidance documents, and non-public knowledge. We'll talk about the old approach and the new approach in working with FDA, in this case. And we'll talk about the pre-submission process and how to do that and what additional support we can tell you about. And then we'll talk about when to submit, when to test, and human factors. We'll lead the last portion. First, we'll discuss regulatory issues of pulse oximeters and blood pressures, outlining the dynamics and ambiguity of the requirements of accuracy determination. Next, we'll provide recommendations and approaches for working with the FDA, followed with specific insights gathered over the years. The when to test section will relate the most common factor that delays clearance in physiological monitors. We'll then end, as I said, with human factors in testing. Next slide, please. Oh, we're there. Nope, let's go back. There we go. Now, there are numerous new applications coming online and predicate devices in this space are limited or simply non-existent. Examples are the use of a significantly different method of measuring SpO2, for example, by using the light source and detector in a cell phone, or remote measurement using pulsatile images from a tablet. Now, there's huge interest in wearables that leads to new populations in the home health or non-patient general wellness applications, among others. And this then brings with it new sensor sites. Now, any of these might force a decision to move to the de novo path in a submission to the FDA, none of which are dealt with in the standards or FDA guidance documents. We'll talk about that later too. Now, new information, and how does that affect the FDA review process? Well, as an example, in December 2020, when the pandemic was reaching its peak, when the COVID pandemic was in full swing, a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine by Schoeding's group cast doubt on the accuracy of pulse oximetry in dark skin. This has had a significant impact on how the FDA deals with new pulsimeter submissions, and even in standard submissions that meet all the FDA requirements. Well, what do you do about this? Let's go to the next slide, please. So using blood pressure as an example, we'll also talk about this. The PPG signal with various adjunct parameters such as ECG and ballistocardiogram is significantly different technology from measurement with cuffs. In fact, some data reviewed by the FDA suggests that the PPG-based devices may be able to meet the ISO-2 standard for blood pressure cuffs, but may not track changes in blood pressure. This has led to new test methods that are not published, but are required by the FDA. Now, the FDA is very familiar with the ISO standards for blood pressure, but does partially recognize the IEEE standard, and also has learned from some of the information like that I just mentioned. So one must glean and combine portions of both standards that the FDA agrees with, and also gather information that is not published. Well, what is the best avenue for new submissions in this ever-changing environment? Next slide, please. Which brings us to standards, FDA guidance documents, and non-public knowledge. So the 510K process is where a device has a predicate, which is a device cleared by the FDA that is very similar to the device under test. The de novo process is where there is no predicate. If there is no predicate, then testing required is more rigorous, and the device acts as its own predicate. Now, up to a few years ago, if a predicated device met a recognized standard and was previously cleared, and a new device was submitted with the same testing and so forth, then the FDA would be forced to clear the new device. That is no longer the case. With new technology or in new applications, as in PPG technology being used to measure pressure, the FDA knowledge is always changing based on new knowledge, or in pulse oximetry, for example, where the FDA guidance is different from the ISO standard. In that case, the guidance document always wins. Next slide, please. So testing of traditional medical physiological monitors that was traditionally used almost exclusively in hospital environments is experiencing a paradigm change because of the home healthcare, wellness devices, and a tremendous upsurge in the volume of new devices. This leads to the need for new test methods because of the different technologies that are being employed. Now, often the FDA requires unpublished methods and acceptance criteria that's based on new information. For example, they are looking for changes in blood pressure, and they have specific ways they'd like those changes to occur. and in some cases, they even recommend a certain number of sites. So the FDA also struggles to learn from new submissions and employs their science division to provide unpublished data for support. Now, this leads to new unpublished test methods and other concepts. Now, they work closely with laboratories like ours to gain practical knowledge regarding applications and methods to meet new challenges in medical testing. Recommendations and approaches for working with the FDA calls for a paradigm shift in dealing with the reviewers. Now, the old paradigm is that we treat the situation as a contentious legal situation and only say the bare minimum. Treat it like a courtroom. The new approach is collaborative and interactive. Now, it's very easy to make a mistake. You don't want to break into jail. I'll talk about that in a moment, but positive interaction is very helpful. Now, if the device fits a recognized standard exactly, then proceeding with a 510K without a pre-submission or talking to the FDA first may be warranted. Next slide, please. So the FDA and thus the reviewers are eager to interact. And the pre-submission is the avenue to gather this information and make certain that you give the FDA exactly what they're looking for. Now, pre-submissions are an inexpensive way to understand the methods of testing, acceptance criteria, sample sizes, and other critical aspects of submission. You can find out the current thinking on standards, which are accepted outright, and which pieces and parts must be combined. Then you compare that information with the performance of the device. From this, you can make a good assessment of the chances of a rapid clearance. Now, specifics on what to do and what not to do during your pre-sub. Never ask how to test. Instead, provide a solution and ask if the FDA agrees. Always include additional options in the pre-submission documentation. For example, if they don't agree with their solution, then immediately go to your next option that's already should be in the pre-submission, maybe as an appendix or as a second option, a third option, that sort of thing. That way, they have no excuse to gloss over it if it's already in there, but yet you have good documentation that you can use during the discussion when it comes to the live talk while you're talking with the FDA. So always include accuracy and acceptance criteria. Don't ask what they recommend. Just they will choose something almost always that you don't want to hear. Be certain the accuracy and test method is actually measuring the accuracy of the technology. The reason I say that is an example of the PPG-based device can pass the ISO blood pressure test for a cuff, even if the device does not detect changes in blood pressure. You should have pre-knowledge of your device and how well it meets the accuracy requirements before you go into your discussions. Next slide, please. So reviewers invite interaction, but you don't want to break into jail. Positive interaction is helpful, but don't raise a question about an area in which you know you cannot or are uncertain that you can succeed. Instead, propose an acceptable alternative and ask if they agree to that solution. Again, never ask what is acceptable. Instead, propose your method, acceptance criteria, intended population, etc. Then ask if they agree. Now, during all live interactions, you must have a seasoned regulatory specialist to direct traffic. When on a call, you have a very limited time, usually 1 hour. So it's imperative that your moderator is well seasoned when working with the FDA, They need to be able to minimize any superfluous discussions or sidetracks, whether by your staff or the FDA personnel. Your moderator must summarize each discussion and decision real time during the meeting and gain agreement during the call. So this person must really be on top of it and understand what the FDA is agreeing to, and restate at the end of each piece, if they have agreed to something, say, okay, this is what we are proposing, and this is what I heard we agree on. Is that true? So now, do not overwhelm the FDA with large numbers of speakers. Practice your call with the actual team that will be in the discussions. Make certain that the speakers are understandable, and plan for questions that might derail your submission, and practice for those eventualities. Practice is a real good way to go over and prepare for your live discussion. Start with the most important issues, and I want to let you know that peer-reviewed publications are effective. However, expert panels are minimally helpful and will not necessarily sway the FDA opinion. And that's especially if the acceptance criteria are not met. Now, all of this assumes the device meets FDA acceptance criteria. Next slide. When to submit? Pre-submissions may be submitted prior to conducting the pivotal trial and are advised with the following aspects. When new technology type is being discussed, or when a significant change or new information and medical knowledge comes along. If the standard is new or updated, or if you have findings that, as I mentioned, that bring technology accuracy into question. So you need to stay abreast of what's being published in the journals while you're during this process. Now, all de novos need to have a pre-submission. That's where you have no predicate device. Next slide, please. Well, when should you test? The most common factor that delays clearance in physiological monitors is the lack of accuracy testing early in the development process. Usually, projects are financially and thus schedule driven, and accuracy testing is left as the final step. In order to conserve costs, only one slot is planned for the accuracy testing, and it can usually gets squeezed shorter and shorter as the project slips, which pretty much they all do. As an example, virtually no one drives a car without insurance. It's a cost that's included in the cost of your personal transportation. And early testing is insurance for the overall project. And so including accuracy testing as a gating item in the schedule during development is crucial. I cannot emphasize enough, test early and often. So you can test small, short pieces of things during the development to make sure you're between the ditches. And you want to constantly query the results and the types of testing you're doing to make certain that it actually does measure what the FDA is going to hear. Next slide, please. So the FDA is increasing focus on usability. That is human factors testing. In 2016, they even provided a guidance document on human factors and is requiring this testing with many more submissions today. Now, they have a list of the highest types of technologies that they require human factors testing for, and those are invasive and life support. But basically, physiological monitoring with new apps, phone, tablet, may result in the user-patient changing medication, or could provide info that would discourage the user from contacting their physician, for example, if they are looking at their blood pressure and it says it's not changing. So human factors are based in the hazard analysis and risk assessment of the device in order to verify that the user can use it safely and make decisions. The two basic parts to a human factor study are formative and summative. The formative portion consists of all inputs that have been utilized during the development of a device, including informal back-to-back or informal back-of-the-napkin discussions through formal surveys and user tests. Everything should be documented so that the information provides a written trail showing the areas of consideration during the device development. So this is your chance during the formative testing to do all kinds of crazy testing, or even have users come in, test the device, and then change things right in the middle of the stream and ask them, well, let's do this instead. Or, so that's where you develop your device and you document the fact that you've done all of this work and you've done appropriate work. And you need to show that in your final portion, which is the summative portion of the final testing, that report should start off with all the things you did during formative testing. That keeps the FDA from asking you, well, did you do this or did you do that? It really does decrease the number of questions. Now, we all know that FDA always has questions, but hopefully you can avoid the showstoppers by doing your formative testing in human factors first. So the summative part is the final validation testing that provides evidence that the device is safe to use. Now, this must be conducted on the final version of the device, and if changes are made, the portions changed must be retested. So in conclusion for my talk today, current regulatory environment is in flux more than ever before. New technology and new applications are causing significant changes in test methods that must be considered. This leads to the need to follow recognized standards, a need to determine which parts of the standards are required but are not clearly defined, and new findings that might lead to a significant amount of non-published requirements that are changing almost daily. Now, pre-submissions provide an avenue to access this information and allow for a highly interactive process to determine just what's needed to obtain successful FDA clearance. Submit your pre-sub early in the process, and the most valuable information from today is to test early and often. Last, pay attention to the FDA's increased focus on human factors and usability testing. Well, I want to thank you for this opportunity to share this information with you. And if there are questions, I believe we have a little bit of time for that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. That was really very instructive. And one thing that rings out to me is this issue about not going into regulators and asking open questions. Always go with a plan, and they'll help you refine the plan. But open questions are a no-no, and that really rung true for me. One of the questions that, well, I've got a question here, which is, where does the PMA pathway fit into the 510K de novo landscape?
Yeah, so the answer to this is that the 510K de novo processes are part of PMA. And though instead of asking for pre-market approval, almost always in these types of devices, the FDA cedes its processes to the ethics committee. And of course, all testing in the world must be regulated by an ethics committee or reviewed by an ethics committee. In the United States, we call that the IRB, Institutional Review Board.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, there is. There's a question at the back. Okay.
Hi, just following up. Sorry, can you
Mic's not on.
Hi.
Needs to be on. Hold on.
Can you hear me?
No, hang on. Hang
it's
on a
coming.
minute,
Okay.
Paul, because you won't be able to hear the question if we...
Is it? I think it's back. Great.
Oh, it's back.
So just an anecdote, really, and whether you could give advice. This wasn't specifically physiological measuring, but a different type of device, in fact, the sleep assessment. So went through a pre-submission process, had a couple of different pre-subs, thought we'd agree the indication of used predicate protocol, then did the submission, and a completely different review team came back with quite contradictory deficiencies in the deficiency process, right the way back to querying the this issue about how similar the indication of use needs to be with the predicate, and the kind of that. And I was wondering what your experience or advice is on that situation where you get a change in review team and you feel that the deficiencies and the original Q-sub minutes are quite inconsistent.
Yeah, so that's documentation, and I understand. I've seen situations like this. This is where your documentation can support you and help you, and this is where your regulatory specialist that's going to be working with the FDA directly comes into play. And if you choose to, then you can push this up the ladder, and you can take it over the head of the reviewers and go to their immediate supervisor, or even insist that it gets pushed higher. As an example, I can talk about some things in relationship to this. I can only talk about the things that I haven't worked on, but I do know that with the first time that an app got cleared as a device was in the Apple Watch for ECG and AFib. And the regulatory specialist took it above the reviewers' heads because they had all said you got to have the device, the hardware, and the app as the device. Yet the regulatory specialist for the company went above the reviewers and got the app approved, and so that's one avenue. But this happens a lot, and what's going on today with everyone, not just the FDA, is that individuals, and especially the FDA, are overwhelmed with work, and they're expanding the number of reviewers. And I have a lot of personal connections and contact with the reviewers at the FDA, and they are all very smart. They're very intelligent, and they know a lot, but they are also getting their feet solid on the ground, and they may be correcting some things that they feel is inaccurate scientifically that had been followed by the FDA in the past. And so the FDA is constantly raising the bar for themselves, but also for the rest of us that actually submit. So that does happen. In the past, if the FDA said one thing and you have it documented, then they're stuck with it. But now that's not so much the case, and you have to work with that or try to go over and raise the question higher in the food chain there.
Right, thank you, Paul. We're on a tight schedule today, but thanks for some really sage advice there. A lot of value for anybody who's going to encounter the FDA at any time in the future. I would sear that into your consciousness and go forward from that perspective.